You're listening to the podcast of Studio Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute episode, we discussed latest academic research on the region. I'm Hanna Stähle, I'm a Slavic studies specialist, born and raised in Belarus, and with me today is Peter Vermeersch.
Hello.
Welcome, Peter.
Nice to be here.
Peter is professor of politics and East European studies at the University of Leuven. He published widely on minority politics, memory, and pro-democracy movements in Central and Eastern Europe, and he also combines rigorous academic research with writing narrative, non-fiction books. Fantastic to have you, Peter. Today we have a very, very special occasion. Usually it's you who is moderating the podcast series. And this time you're the guest.
We reversed the roles, indeed. Yeah.
And there is another special moment. You just published a book, which is in front of me. In Dutch, it's called Polsslag, who in popsong Oost-Europa hoop heeft.
That's a very nice pronunciation of Dutch, I have to say.
You challenged me a little bit. This is actually my first book I had to read in Dutch, and it was quite a beautiful experience. Mm-hmm. So in English, we can translate the book as the pulse or the heartbeat, how a song gives Eastern Europe hope. So in this book, you're largely writing about the protest movement in Belarus and the role of music.
Yes.
But we know that some of our listeners may not be that familiar with the region, that familiar with Belarus in particular. So Peter, tell us a little bit, how did you discover Belarus? What has sparked your interest in this region?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've been working on pro-democracy protests and movements for a while now in the region of Central and East Central Europe, let's say, because I studied the languages and cultures of that region since the early 1990s, and I teach about it at the University of Leuven. And I've been for a long time intrigued by the case of Belarus, which I visited, and I've got friends from there and colleagues who are Belarusian. And it struck me that in recent times, in many Western countries, including Belgium, the Netherlands, the country seems to have been forgotten largely. And in the current circumstances of Putin in Russia and the war in Ukraine, it seems it gets forgotten even more. Well, I think it is of strategic and cultural importance. And very often it's even forgotten that it's a separate country, which is quite ironic in the current circumstances. So I wanted to raise attention for it by writing a book about it. And on top of that, I've been for a long time intrigued by popular music and the power of song in society and in politics, and specifically in Belarus, in the protests of 2020. The power of song was very vivid in the face of Lukashenko's regime. So I really asked in this book, how do artists and musicians in particular help to challenge authoritarianism and keep the hope for democracy alive, even in the harshest of circumstances, and even later on in exile. And again, I think Belarus is an extraordinary case from which, in a way, there is much to learn. And that's why I wrote the book. And I wrote it in Dutch specifically for an audience in Belgium and in the Netherlands.
The opening of the book is quite fascinating in itself. I found you're describing the events in August 2020 when the protest movement broke out, essentially the largest protest movement in Belarus since its independence, a very special moment. Yeah. And there is a comparison of Minsk to Rio de Janeiro, which is not something you expect, that type of comparisons with any Eastern European or Central European city.
That's right.
So it's kind of describing this atmosphere of a musical festival. So tell us about this song. So what is this song about that you put at the heart of this book?
Of the book, yeah. Well, yeah, indeed. Rio de Janeiro, that's one of my interviewees said that it was Rio de Janeiro in Minsk in this hot summer of 2020, exactly 5 years ago. It was a season full of hope, and we tend to forget. Hundreds of thousands of people took the streets after the rigged elections in which Lukashenko claimed to have received 80% of the votes, but obviously it wasn't true. And after that, extreme police violence happened against the demonstrators. And Yeah, you know, it was a season of hope because it seemed to me from a distance, but also I think people who participated in the protests, that something was going to happen. That this time, after so many years of protesting for democracy, there would be some possibility that the regime would fall and that indeed it would change. And I open the book, and I also close it, we'll come to that later on, with a vignette of band members of a band called Irderat, and they're a folk fantasy music band, who performed during that festive summer of protests a well-known Soviet-era rock song by the band Kino. And the song is called Peremen, which translates as changes, was one of the songs, and there were many other songs, but one of the songs that was really becoming iconic for this summer. And in the middle of the book, I also tell about the many stories of that particular rock song, because it's quite a complicated history.
Why this rock song that was created in the 80s and was
Indeed.
really iconic
Yeah.
for the Soviet times?
Yeah, so before I go into that, I need to say that what is really chilling about the story of this particular band who played this particular rock song on bagpipes, quite extraordinary, is that sometime later after the protests they were all arrested and they had to spend time in prison because of singing a Soviet-era rock song and playing it on bagpipes. It's quite extraordinary.
And eventually was leaving the country.
Yeah, exactly. And so this song played a role against the background of, or I say, next to many other songs and bands, like Torband is, for example, a famous Belarusian band who produced protest songs, or Yuri Stilsky from Daidarohu, and Levon Volsky is a very popular and important Belarusian singer-songwriter. They all play a role in the book as well. But the story of Peremen, the Changes song, is quite gripping, I think, because it's in a way an unlikely protest song. It was some sort of new wave song, you could say, from the 1980s, written in an apartment in Leningrad at the time. It's in Russian. It would be unlikely in a way to figure as a protest song in Belarusian protests in 2020, but it did, and people got arrested for it. I was intrigued by that complex, almost contradictory history of that particular song.
I remember vividly this moment in August 2020 when the song played another crucial role on the 6th of August with the so-called DJs of Change, who has sabotaged eventually a state concert which was not allowing the opposition figure Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the presidential candidate, to actually speak in public before the day of elections, and they have performed and have used the song Peremen on that day, which was quite
it was quite something,
quite
wasn't
a big
it?
moment.
It was a big moment.
Indeed.
That's when the song, I think, really acquired some larger symbolic meaning, and it became something. It also connects generations. I think that's also one of the powerful thing about this particular song. It's not about only the young generations, but it's about older generations too. They would recognize it, and indeed with these DJs on the 6th of August of 2020, these guys were supposed to play some neutral music on some sort of festivity organized
for children,
by
right?
Organized by the authorities. But by organizing this event, the authorities had prevented that Tikhanovskaya would be able to hold an electoral meeting, a big rally that was planned there. So these DJs, they plugged in their equipment and they played the Peremen song by Kino, by this Soviet band. And then immediately the police intervened and blocked the whole thing. And then the song became basically not only a symbolic protest song, but it was also forbidden later on by the regime. It was seen as an extremist symbol, as if, you were waving around swastikas or something if you were singing this song. So it was a forbidden song then. But ironically enough, and that's how authoritarian regimes seem to work, in another part of the book I describe how the former members of the band, not the singer because he died in a car accident back in 1990, but the other band members, they had a reunion concert in Minsk and they sang that song. And then, apparently, because they are from Russia, I suppose, the regime was okay with that. So there are many ironies here attached to that particular
many
song.
paradoxes also you're describing. You just spoke also about the issue of generations and how the song is connecting across generations and also regions.
Yeah.
So you're writing about Belarus, but actually you're providing a much broader frame in the book, and you're writing about pro-democracy movements also in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in GDR, in
Indeed.
Belarus, in Russia, and the connecting tissue is, if you like, the music.
Indeed, I was struck by how powerful music can be in pro-democracy protests and how much of a heritage it is in Central and Eastern Europe at large, you could say. And the politically charged popular music culture in Eastern Europe is very big, from the Solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s, and indeed Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. There was this famous band, the Plastic People of the Universe, right? That Václav Havel was very fond of back in the days. But all this music is a very often overlooked part, I think, of people trying to have a voice in undemocratic circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And it's literally about having a voice, about together singing a song and letting the regime know that you are there. And if you sing collectively, it has an effect on how you feel, and it creates a sense of collectivity that might not be there in an authoritarian regime, or that might be discouraged by an authoritarian regime who tries to isolate and atomize citizens.
And that was quite a fascinating, audacious moment also in Belarusian history, with this collective emerging and music helping people really overcome this fear and realizing that they have a voice. Yeah. And you're writing about this also in this book. You're writing about resistance, you're writing about courage, you're writing about hope, but also this repression, massive repression by the regime.
Yeah, that's the flip side, of course, that, that on the one hand, you could say that artistic work, like music, plays a crucial role in democratic emancipation. But you also see that regimes like the one that Lukashenko has installed in Belarus is targeting artists and putting them in jail, forcing them into exile. My book is full of admiration, I think, for these musicians who went to the streets, not only musicians, but poets and visual artists and all kinds of people working in the creative sphere, let's say. How important they were, but also how courageous they were, because they knew that they were risking something. And writing this for a Belgian audience and for a Dutch audience or a West European audience, that's really how I want to position myself, I think, is also translating that courage to their minds and asking basically the question, would you risk it? Could you see yourself doing this in those circumstances? I ask myself sometimes, would I have the courage to do it? So it's a book full of admiration. I try to convey that admiration to the reader.
Absolutely. And I recall a conversation we had some time ago about hope, indeed. Yeah. And you were making a very powerful comment. It's not only about hope, it's also about validating this hope.
Yeah. So it's good that you remind me of that. I think that's the role of academics, isn't it? To some extent. I mean, there's research, of course, and come to meticulous findings on the ground by doing our research, but also have to communicate about our research and communicate about the things that are forgotten. And hope is forgotten a lot of times in Belarus and outside Belarus, and I think by giving it attention from the academic side, we validate it and we say, like, this is happening, this is real, and we need to keep it alive, because otherwise there will not be any changes possible.
And this is this really rare combination of a rigorous academic research on the one hand, and at the same time it's a deeply personal reflection on what has been happening in the region, still continuing happening in the region, this transition moment that you're describing, really combining with the many interviews you had, your travel to Belarus, your travel also to Latvia.
And talking to people in exile, because that's the sort of the second half of the book. It's sort of traveling to Warsaw, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, places where...
Riga.
Riga is an important place too. So where Belarusian communities have to continue in exile, and where artists are doing their thing, trying to make community, continuing the same type of work, but in very difficult circumstances. And there's the political aspect there too. Tikhanovskaya and people from the opposition who were exiled as well, they have to keep the spirit of democracy alive outside of Belarus. So it's about, in a way, preserving democracy for a later time, perhaps. And I try to make a portrait of that work of preserving democracy with personal stories of meeting people and talking to them and telling their stories and interacting with me, and about my own feelings about this, by being touched and being moved by their courage.
What has changed for you since you traveled to Belarus in 2016 and then observed the change that was happening? What were the ruptures? What was new in this protest movement?
When I went to Belarus before 2020, you could see actually that there was something ready to change. There were people ready to force some sort of more democratic system. Opposition was more organized, but also I think just young people found it a bit silly that there was such an authoritarian leader in place still. Now, I think what has happened now since 2020 and this enormous repression, it hasn't become easier, but it hasn't also become easier because of international circumstances. Back, 10, maybe 15 years ago, there was still this idea that we had to shame authoritarians into respecting human rights, into respecting the rights of prisoners, into not putting people in prison for political reasons and so on. But what we see more recently in the current geopolitical circumstances is that it's much more a world of wheeling and dealing and not so much a world of norms anymore. And it's hard to shame authoritarian leaders because we have some important authoritarian leaders or would-be authoritarian leaders in powerful states across the globe that are not ashamed anymore of doing what they are doing. They're bragging about their authoritarian tendencies. So that makes it quite complicated, I think, and all the more important to validate the hope of the people who are trying to resist that and still put human rights, for example, or the rights of prisoners on the agenda.
And repressions still continue in Belarus. Hundreds of thousands of people have left the country. We just had last week 3 people being arrested on political charges, so the repressions are still there.
Repressions are still there. In total, about 600,000 people left the country, on a country of not even 10 million people.
Similar to Belgium somewhat.
Yes. Indeed. That's also the reason why I think the Belgian imagination should be fired up and people should be making comparisons and thinking about the people in Belarus. But so a lot of people left and the situation continues to be very troublesome. And people are still put in prison, even when on the other side, people are also released from prison. It was very significant, I think, when we saw the release last week of 14 political prisoners, high-level, let's say, opposition figures, primarily Sergei Tikhanovsky, the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Of course, very important for these people who got released. But it is also difficult to judge where it will lead to. It seems like at the moment it's not that the regime is going to be held accountable for the many political prisoners that it has taken and for the 1,100 and more political prisoners that are still behind bars in Belarus. It seems like these political prisoners are used as bargaining chips in a cynical game of so-called negotiations, probably over sanctions, and the regime uses them as money in the bank almost. And this is a chilling realization. Yeah.
At the same time, for Belarusians, including myself, this was a moment of hope after 5 years since the protest movement.
Absolutely.
And it seems that the story hasn't finished, so it's still this transition moment that is there.
Yeah.
What gives you hope when you look at the region, when you look at Belarus, and Central Eastern Europe at this moment?
So what gives me hope is that the exiled opposition leaders, the exiled cultural workers, let's say the creative people coming from Belarus, are so inspired and stubborn and continue, and they continue to to keep the spirit of democracy alive. It's amazing. In a lot of Western European countries, people are a little bit tired of democracy sometimes. They find it annoying. They don't like the debates. But they have a free voice. And I think what Belarusian people can teach us is that, well, it's not self-evident. So be proud of it, fight for it. And the way they are prepared for making Belarus a democracy once the regime falls, and eventually I think Lukashenko will fall. We can't say when and how it will look like, and we don't know obviously how the relationship with Russia will develop, and we don't know if Russia will allow Belarus to be an independent country. These are all very tough and difficult questions, but at least the exiled activists are prepared, and they're prepared to fight for democracy, and that is so important in these times.
We have a lot of academics, a lot of students among our audience. What would be your advice when it comes to Belarus, when it comes to the region, what to pay attention to?
Well, overall, give it some attention. At least it's a case that is intriguing, that needs to be studied. And not only study the mechanisms of authoritarianism, not only study the mechanisms of populism, the mechanisms that are used top-down to control a population, but give attention to the opposite movement, to the way that people give meaning to democracy, the way that they organize and keep organizing in order to be ready to install some sort of democratization and validate that particular hope. And within that, discover art and music and cultural, because there is really such a rich world of Belarusian creativity to be discovered. I would advise academics to have a look into that and write about it and show it to a broader audience.
On that note, validating hope is the call to action from Peter Vermeersch. Thank you for this interview, for this podcast, and for writing this fascinating book.
Thank you so much, Hanna.